Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. As I always do, I want to thank you for giving me the most precious gift that you have, which is your time. If you have watched any of my videos or intend to watch this video, you're giving me an invaluable gift, which is your time. Your time is your own, and it's precious beyond measure, and you've given some of that time to me, so I thank you for that. If you like the content that I'm giving, please consider giving this video a like and a subscribe. And consider writing a comment in the comments below. Even if you feel compelled to write a hate comment, hate comments feed the algorithm just as much as positive comments. Though, not gonna lie, I would prefer positive comments. In the video that I published yesterday, I predicted that that video or one of the next two videos, which would be the one I'm posting today or the one I intend to post after this, would get the most hate comments of any video that I would ever produce. Yesterday I posted a video about how the flat earth has become a thing again in 2024, and how the Bible has nothing to do with that. The Bible doesn't teach that the earth is flat. I brought receipts that show that the Bible doesn't teach that the earth is flat, and how the flat earth movement doesn't really have anything to do with Christianity. Christendom never really considered the earth to be flat. But anyway, you can check out that video for more information. In today's video, I'm going to talk about one of the biggest controversies that I dealt with when I was an Evangelical, Fundamentalist, Bible-believing Christian. And that controversy is speaking in tongues, or glossalalia, if you want to get scientific about it. Now, I want to be clear that in my denomination, we didn't do speaking in tongues. I mean, we didn't forbid it, but never once did a preacher talk about the importance of speaking in tongues. On a few occasions, I believe that I might have heard someone next to me in the pews or in the pew behind me kind of muttering in what may have been speaking in tongues, quote unquote, and later in this video I'll get to why I put air quotes around it. But it wasn't a part of the Christianity that I practiced. It was, however, a controversy because there were and are some Christians who are just fanatically about speaking in tongues. And more than one Christian told me that, you know, my salvation was in question if I didn't speak in tongues. Now, how did we get there? Well, speaking in tongues, if you're not familiar, there's two ways to look at it. There's the religious way to look at it, which is that you're speaking in a foreign language that you've never studied in the furtherance of the gospel. Like you're taking the gospel to somebody who doesn't speak the language that you speak, and the Holy Spirit miraculously imparts to you this gift to speak in their language. That's the biblical way of looking at it. The actual way of looking at it is that someone's just chanting in gibberish. And if you watch videos that dump on evangelical Christianity, you may see some compilations that show people, quote unquote, speaking in tongues. And what they'll do is they'll speak a sentence in English, and then they'll chant a few syllables in gibberish, and then they'll go back to English. Or I've seen a video where there was some church service somewhere where two guys were swinging swords at each other and supposedly speaking in tongues. Again, what they were really doing was chanting in gibberish. And like I said, it's a thing that a lot of Christians really hang their hats on. So how do we get here? Well, we have to go back to the New Testament. We go to Acts chapter 2. And to set the scene, this was at the Feast of Pentecost, which was a Jewish festival that took place 50 days after Passover. The word Pentecost comes from, I think, the Greek for 50, and it's also the word from which Christians who identify as Pentecostals, it's where they get their name. Anyway, so in Acts chapter 2, the writer of the book of Acts, purportedly Luke, sets the scene for us. He says that it's 50 days after Jesus' resurrection, and the disciples sorry about that. The disciples are gathered in this room that they've rented, and they're trying to figure out their next move. Jesus has supposedly ascended into heaven. The disciple Judas unalived himself, if you know what I'm saying. YouTube doesn't like the S word. And they had appointed somebody to replace him, and they were trying to figure out what to do next. And the passage says that suddenly what appeared to be tongues of fire came down from above them and rested on each of them. And then they began to speak in tongues, which is to say, speak in other languages that they had never studied. And then a few verses later, it goes on to say that the crowd, people in the crowd were like, here we are gathered here from this nation and that nation and this nation and that nation, and yet you're speaking in our language, and you've never studied our language. How can this be? And then the disciples go on to say it was a miraculous gift of the Holy Spirit, yada, yada, yada. And then tongues comes up a few more times in the New Testament, mainly in terms of like giving instructions about how speaking in tongues are to be carried out, how to react when someone is speaking in tongues, things like that. Anyway, from the context, you can see why the gospel or the writer of Acts would want to say that God supposedly imparted to the disciples this ability to speak in languages that they'd never studied. And that is that they were at the cusp of the beginning of Christianity, and they believed that they needed to spread the gospel. And so the writer claims that God imparted into them this ability to speak in languages that they had never studied, which would work out really well on the mission field, because if you don't speak the language and you're trying to spread the gospel, if God gives you this ability to speak in that language, that helps to further the gospel. So, all well and good if you believe the New Testament. But here's the thing. After the New Testament, Christendom basically forgot about speaking in tongues for the next 1900 years. Now, there were Christians who published, treatises about, why do we ignore speaking in tongues? Is this a thing that we should be doing? So on and so forth. But for the most part, speaking in tongues was just forgotten about for 1900 years. And I think the reason is that Christendom assumed that the gift of tongues, and also other charismatic quote-unquote gifts, as they're called in Christianity and Christendom, was that they were necessary at the time. Again, if you believe that the New Testament is true, that these gifts were necessary at the time to spread the gospel, but that they, stopped being necessary after the first century because, Christianity kind of hung its hat on Latin, and Christians spoke in Latin and, of course, Greek too. And then in cases where they went out to be missionaries, they just learned the language that they were supposed to be speaking and teaching in. So, like I said, for about 1900 years, Christendom just kind of forgot about speaking in tongues. And it was just regarded as a first century miracle that was relevant to the first century. For reasons that I am not even going to try to begin to get into here, in 1909, there was what's called the Azusa Street Revival. And to make a very long story very short, a group of Christians in Southern California began practicing what they believed was speaking in tongues again. And that was the beginning of the modern charismatic or Pentecostal movement. And to this day, there's a subset of evangelical Christians who believe strongly that God imparts to them the ability to speak in foreign languages that they've never studied. And just as many of those Christians get really uptight about it, and they, act as if Christians who don't speak in tongues aren't truly Christians or are ignoring the Bible. I saw a bumper sticker once that said Acts chapter 2 was still in my Bible, as if, the driver was saying that anybody who doesn't speak in tongues or practice charismatic gifts was just ignoring part of the Bible. So that's why it was a controversy, because in my faith journey, I dealt with a lot of Christians who got really, really fanatical about that and questioned my salvation because I didn't practice speaking in tongues. So that's the beginning and the end of the religious aspect. Now let's get to the reality of the matter. Of course, no one can ever speak in a language that they haven't studied. It's not scientifically possible. So what you're seeing when somebody supposedly speaks in tongues is actually they're just muttering gibberish. And linguists have studied these instances of supposed speaking in tongues, and the sounds that the Christian makes aren't consistent with any known language, and they don't contain any sort of internal consistency that you would expect from someone speaking in another language. It's just gibberish. And I'll be kind and give the Christians who do speak in tongues the benefit of the doubt and say that this speaking in gibberish is, the result of religious ecstasy combined with peer pressure, rather than, God imparting some sort of miraculous speaking to them, or some sort of miraculous gift to them that allows them to speak in other languages. Truthfully, if anybody has ever started fluently speaking another language that they've never ever studied, call National Geographic, because they're going to want to write about that. Because everything we know about language, everything we know about knowledge in the human brain, throw it out the window, because it's just not a thing. So if you believe that the New Testament is true, I believe that you're wrong, because I'm an agnostic, of course, and I don't believe that 98% of what supposedly happened in the New Testament actually happened, at least in terms of the miracles. If you believe that God has imparted to you the ability to speak in a language that you've never studied, you are doubly wrong. And if you believe that chanting gibberish when you're worshiping or preaching or what have you is an example of biblical speaking in tongues, you're triply wrong. So yeah, that's the general gist of the tongue-speaking controversy, and why I didn't believe that speaking in tongues was real when I was a Christian, and I certainly don't believe that it's real now that I'm not a Christian. Anyway, that's my rant for the day. As usual, I'd like to thank you for your time. Please give this video a like and subscribe, and when I publish my next video, if it doesn't get me more hate comments than this one, I'll be surprised. But look forward to my next video, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you.